What happens when six armed slave hunters believe they've cornered just another runaway, but discover they've been hunting the most dangerous man in Confederate territory? This is the story of Samuel "Ghost" Washington, a master spy whose mission would change the course of the Civil War forever. If you love incredible true stories of courage and intelligence, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The morning mist clung to the Virginia forest like a shroud, filtering the pale October sunlight into ghostly beams that danced between the towering oaks and maples. The year was 1863, and the Civil War had turned these once peaceful woodlands into a hunting ground where human beings were prey. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and the distant smoke of Confederate campfires, a constant reminder that this was enemy territory where discovery meant death. 6 men moved through the undergrowth with the confidence of predators who had never known failure. Their leader, Jeremiah Colt, was a weathered man in his 40s with cold gray eyes and a reputation that stretched from Richmond to the Carolina border. His wide-brimmed hat cast shadows over a face marked by years of what he called retrieving property, though the property in question walked on 2 legs and had beating hearts. Colt had been in this business for over a decade, and his success rate was legendary among plantation owners who valued their human investments. The war had been good to men like Colt. With so many able-bodied men fighting in the Confederate Army, the responsibility for maintaining order on the home front had fallen to civilian contractors. Slave hunters commanded premium prices for their services, and the legal protections afforded by the Fugitive Slave Act meant they could operate with virtual impunity. Dead or alive, the bounty was the same, and Colt had long ago stopped caring which option his quarry preferred. "Tracks fresh," muttered Pike Henderson, the group's tracker, as he knelt beside a barely visible footprint in the soft earth. Pike was thin as a rail but could follow a trail like a bloodhound, reading sign that most men would never notice. His weathered hands traced the outline of the print, noting the depth, the angle, the way the earth had been displaced. No more than 2 hours old, he's moving northeast, probably trying to reach the Rappahannock. Pike had learned his craft during 10 years of frontier living before the war, hunting game and tracking lost livestock across the Virginia wilderness. When the conflict began, he had briefly served as a scout for the Confederate Army until a Yankee bullet at Antietam had left him with a permanent limp and a discharge from military service. Tracking runaway slaves paid better than most civilian work, and Pike had a family to feed. He told himself that what he did was legal, necessary, and profitable. 3 justifications that helped him sleep at night. Colt spat into the leaves, a habit that revealed his contempt for the men he hunted. "Fool thinks he can swim to freedom. They all think that." He adjusted the rifle slung across his shoulder and looked at his men with the calculating gaze of a commander deploying his forces. "Thomas, you and Briggs circle around to the east. Cut off any escape route toward the river. Pike, you stay with me and follow the main trail. Murphy and Dawson spread wide to the west. This one's been running for 3 days, and I'm tired of chasing shadows." The men nodded and began to disperse with the practiced efficiency of a well-drilled unit. They were a motley crew, former soldiers, drifters, and men who had found their calling in the lucrative business of human hunting. Thomas Briggs was a deserter from the 12th Virginia Infantry who had discovered that hunting slaves was safer and more profitable than facing Union artillery. Murphy was a former overseer whose brutal methods had made him unemployable on respectable plantations. Young Dawson was the newest member of the group, eager to prove himself and earn his share of the bounty money that could set a man up for life. The Fugitive Slave Act had made their work legal, and the war had made it profitable. Plantation owners paid handsomely for the return of their investments, and the Confederate government offered additional bounties for the capture of runaway slaves who might provide intelligence to Union forces. Dead or alive, the bounty was the same, and most hunters preferred the simplicity of the former option. What none of them knew was that their quarry was no ordinary runaway slave. Samuel Washington, though that wasn't the name on his forged papers, crouched motionless in the thick branches of an ancient oak 30 feet above the forest floor. His dark skin blended with the shadows of the canopy, and his breathing was so controlled it barely disturbed the leaves around him. He'd been watching the hunters for the past hour, studying their movements, learning their patterns, cataloging their strengths and weaknesses with the methodical precision of a trained intelligence operative. At 28 years old, Samuel possessed the lean, muscular build of a man who had spent years training his body to be a weapon. But it was his mind that made him truly dangerous. Born free in Philadelphia to parents who had escaped slavery through the Underground Railroad, Samuel had been educated at Oberlin College before the war began. His father, a successful businessman who had built a small fortune in the shipping trade, had insisted that his son receive the finest education available to a black man in antebellum America. When President Lincoln issued the call for volunteers, Samuel had answered, but not in the way anyone expected. While thousands of free blacks and escaped slaves were forming colored regiments to fight for the Union, Samuel had been recruited for a different kind of service. The Union Army's intelligence network had recognized something special in the young man who spoke with the refined accent of an educated northerner, but could slip into the dialect of a field hand without missing a beat. Colonel Lafayette Baker, head of the Union's intelligence operations, had personally overseen Samuel's training. For 6 months, Samuel had learned the arts of espionage, sabotage, and survival from some of the most skilled operatives in the Federal Service. He had studied Confederate military organization, learned to forge documents, mastered the use of codes and ciphers, and trained in hand-to-hand combat with instructors who had served in the Mexican War. For 2 years, he had moved through Confederate territory like a ghost, gathering intelligence on troop movements, supply lines, and strategic positions. He had posed as everything from a house servant to a field hand to a free black craftsman, always adapting his cover to match the situation. His reports had contributed to Union victories at Shiloh and Antietam, and his intelligence network had helped Federal forces intercept Confederate supply convoys worth millions of dollars. His current mission was his most dangerous yet: infiltrate the Confederate stronghold at Fredericksburg and gather intelligence on General Lee's winter plans. The information he carried in his memory could potentially end the war months earlier and save thousands of lives on both sides. But first he had to deal with 6 men who thought they were hunting a helpless runaway. Samuel watched as Colton Pike examined his deliberately left footprints. He had been leading them in circles for hours, always staying just far enough ahead to keep them interested, but never so far that they would give up. Every step had been calculated, every broken twig and disturbed leaf placed with precision. He was conducting a masterclass in misdirection, fusing the hunter's own assumptions against them. "He's getting tired," Colt said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Look how deep these prints are. He's dragging his feet now." Pike nodded, though something in his expression suggested doubt. "Maybe, but this one's been clever so far. Led us through that creek to throw off the scent, doubled back twice. Most runaways panic and just run straight." "They're all clever until we catch them," Colt replied with the arrogance of a man who had never encountered real opposition. "And we always catch them." Samuel allowed himself a thin smile. The irony was perfect. They were so focused on following his trail that they had no idea he was directly above them, close enough to hear every word, close enough to kill them all if he chose to do so. He could have ended this hunt in seconds, but that would alert Confederate authorities and compromise his mission. Better to let them think they were in control while he maneuvered them into position for the trap he was preparing. The sound of a snapping branch made all 3 men freeze. Thomas Briggs emerged from the eastern woods, his face flushed with excitement and the exertion of moving quickly through difficult terrain. "Found something," he called out, jogging toward them with the enthusiasm of a hound that had picked up a fresh scent. "There's a clearing about a quarter-mile ahead. Looks like he stopped there maybe to rest. Ground's all torn up like he was digging for something." Colt's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a hunter who sensed his prey was finally within reach. Probably buried some supplies when he first ran. They sometimes do that, cache food and water along escape routes. He shouldered his rifle and gestured for the others to follow. "Come on, if he's that close we can end this before noon and be back in town by evening." As the 3 men moved away, Samuel remained perfectly still, counting their footsteps until the sound faded into the general noise of the forest. He had indeed created the disturbance in the clearing, not to hide supplies, but to set a trap that would demonstrate just how badly these men had underestimated their quarry. The torn-up ground concealed a carefully constructed pit, covered with branches and leaves and lined with sharpened stakes. It wouldn't kill anyone who fell into it, but it would certainly slow them down and create the kind of confusion that Samuel could exploit. More importantly, it would force them to bunch together in a defensive position, making them easier to observe and, if necessary, neutralize. Samuel had learned long ago that the key to successful intelligence work was controlling the battlefield, and he intended to choose the time and place of every encounter with these hunters. Samuel waited until the hunters were well out of sight before beginning his descent. He moved through the branches like a shadow, using techniques learned from Cherokee scouts who had trained Union intelligence operatives in the arts of wilderness survival. Every movement was deliberate, every handhold tested before committing his weight. The Cherokee had taught him that the forest was not an obstacle to be overcome, but an ally to be embraced. When he reached the ground, he paused to listen to the subtle sounds of the woodland around him. The forest had returned to its natural rhythms, birds calling, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant chatter of a squirrel defending its territory. But underneath it all, he could hear the heavy footsteps of men who had never learned to move quietly through the wilderness, men who brought the noise and chaos of civilization with them wherever they went. Samuel began to follow his hunters, staying well back and using the terrain to remain hidden. He knew these woods better than they did. He had spent 3 days studying every trail, every hiding spot, every potential escape route. The hunters thought they were pursuing him, but in reality, he was herding them exactly where he wanted them to go, like a shepherd guiding sheep toward the slaughter pen. The clearing lay ahead, and with it, the first test of whether these men were as dangerous as their reputation suggested, or simply bullies who had grown overconfident hunting. Frightened, untrained runaways. Samuel checked the knife concealed in his boot and the small pistol hidden beneath his tattered shirt. He hoped he wouldn't need either weapon, but 2 years of operating behind enemy lines had taught him that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. In this business, the difference between life and death often came down to preparation, and Samuel had learned to prepare for everything. The real hunt was about to begin, and for the first time in their careers, these slave hunters were about to discover what it felt like to be the prey. The clearing stretched before the 6 hunters like a natural amphitheater, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush that seemed to press in from all sides. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy above, illuminating the disturbed earth that had drawn their attention like moths to a flame. To Jeremiah Colt and his men, it looked like the perfect place to corner their quarry, an open space where a desperate runaway might make his final stand. They had no idea they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap designed by one of the Union Army's most skilled intelligence operatives. "Spread out," Colt ordered, his voice low but carrying clearly in the still air. His years of experience had taught him to be cautious, even when victory seemed assured. "Check every inch of this place. If he buried supplies here, I want them found. And keep your eyes on the tree line. Wounded animals are the most dangerous." The men fanned out across the clearing with practiced efficiency, their rifles ready, eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of movement. They moved with the confidence of professionals who had done this many times before, but also with the underlying tension of men who knew that cornered prey could be unpredictable and dangerous. Pike Henderson knelt beside the torn earth, running his weathered fingers through the loose soil with the delicate touch of a man reading a story written in dirt and displaced stones. His tracker's instincts were telling him something was wrong, but he couldn't quite identify what it was. "This is fresh," he said, frowning as he examined the disturbed ground more closely. "Real fresh, like it was done this morning." He looked up at Colt with troubled eyes. "But that doesn't make sense. If he was here this morning, why would he stick around to dig? He should have been running." Murphy, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained teeth and the cruel eyes of someone who enjoyed his work too much, laughed harshly at Pike's concerns. "Course it's fresh, probably came back for whatever he hid here. These people ain't got the sense God gave a mule." He spat into the leaves and adjusted his grip on his rifle. "They always think they're smarter than they are, until we put them in chains." From his concealed position 40 yards away, Samuel Washington watched the scene unfold, with the detached precision of a chess master, observing his opponent's moves. He had positioned himself behind a fallen log, covered with ferns and moss, that provided perfect concealment while giving him clear sightlines to the entire clearing. The position also offered multiple escape routes and excellent cover from rifle fire, details that might prove crucial in the next few minutes. The hunters were making every mistake he had hoped they would. They were bunched too close together, their attention focused downward on the disturbed ground, rather than scanning for threats from above or from the surrounding forest. Most critically, they had positioned themselves with their backs to the thickest part of the woodland, exactly where Samuel wanted them when the trap was sprung. But as he watched through the small brass telescope that was part of his intelligence equipment, Samuel's trained eye began to pick up details that made him revise his initial assessment of these men. Colt moved with the fluid economy of motion that spoke of military training, probably cavalry from the way he carried himself. His positioning of the other hunters wasn't random. He had placed them to cover multiple escape routes while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. Pike's tracking skills were genuinely impressive. The man was reading sign that most people would never notice, and his growing unease suggested instincts honed by years of dangerous work. These weren't just brutal thugs with rifles. They were professionals who had survived in a dangerous business by being good at what they did. That made them more dangerous than Samuel had initially assumed, but it also made them more predictable. Professional hunters followed patterns, and patterns could be exploited by someone who understood them. "Found it," called out Dawson, the youngest of the group, from near the center of the clearing. The boy was barely 20, with the eager enthusiasm of someone trying to prove himself to older, more experienced men. "There's something buried here." The others converged on his position as Dawson began to dig with his hands, his excitement overriding the caution that might have saved him. Samuel tensed, knowing what they were about to discover and preparing for the chaos that would follow. He had buried a small cloth bundle containing moldy bread, a broken knife, and a few worthless trinkets, the kind of pathetic supplies a desperate runaway might cache in hopes of surviving another day in the wilderness. But he had also buried something else, something that would demonstrate to these hunters that they had seriously underestimated their quarry. Dawson's hand closed around the bundle, and he pulled it from the earth with a grunt of satisfaction. "Got it," he said, holding up the dirty cloth like a trophy. "Looks like food," and the ground beneath his feet gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. Dawson plunged into the carefully concealed pit Samuel had spent hours digging and camouflaging. The hole was 6 feet deep and lined with sharpened stakes, not enough to kill, but certainly enough to injure and terrify. The stakes had been positioned to wound rather than kill, because Samuel needed these men alive and cooperative for what came next. Dawson's scream of pain and surprise echoed through the forest as he crashed down onto the wooden spikes, the sound carrying for miles in the still air. "Dawson!" Colt shouted, rushing toward the pit with his rifle raised. The other hunters followed, their formation dissolving into chaos as they clustered around the hole, like concerned parents around an injured child. All their professional discipline evaporated in the face of seeing one of their own hurt and trapped. "My leg!" Dawson cried from the bottom of the pit, his voice high with pain and fear. "Something's got my leg. I can't move." Pike knelt at the edge and peered down into the shadowy depths, his tracker's eyes quickly taking in the details of the trap. "It's a pit," he said, his voice tight with sudden understanding and growing dread. "This whole thing's a trap. Someone dug this and covered it over." The implications hit all of them at the same moment. This wasn't the desperate hiding place of a frightened runaway. This was a carefully planned and executed ambush, the work of someone with military training and the patience to prepare the battlefield in advance. Colt's head snapped up, his gray eyes scanning the tree line with new wariness and the growing realization that they might not be the hunters in this situation. "Everybody back to back," he ordered, his voice sharp with command authority. "Now, we're exposed here." But it was too late for proper defensive positioning. They were exposed in the center of the clearing, clustered around the pit like moths around a flame, silhouetted against the disturbed earth. Samuel could have picked off 2 or 3 of them before they even realized where the shots were coming from. But killing them would serve no purpose and might compromise his larger mission. Instead, he chose a different approach, one that would demonstrate his superiority while keeping his options open. You boys seem to have lost something, Samuel called out, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing with the educated accent of a northern gentleman. The hunters spun toward the sound, rifles raised, but they couldn't see him. His position behind the fallen log kept him completely hidden, while allowing his voice to project across the open space. "Show yourself," Colt demanded, his rifle sweeping back and forth across the tree line in a desperate search for a target. His military training was evident in the way he moved, but his confusion was equally obvious. "Now, why would I do that?" Samuel replied, amusement clear in his tone. "You've been chasing me for 3 days. Seems to me you should know where I am by now." The voice was wrong. All of them realized it at the same moment, and the realization sent a chill down their spines. This wasn't the panicked, desperate voice of a frightened runaway slave. This was the calm, educated tone of a man completely in control of the situation, someone who spoke like a college professor or a military officer. "Who are you?" Pike asked, his tracker's instincts telling him that everything about this hunt had been wrong from the beginning. The trail had been too easy to follow, the signs too obvious, the quarry too predictable. They had been led here like cattle to slaughter. Samuel considered his answer carefully, weighing the tactical advantages of revelation against the risks of exposure. His mission required him to reach Fredericksburg, and these men represented a significant obstacle to that goal. But they also represented an opportunity. If handled correctly, this encounter could actually advance his objectives rather than hindering them. "My name is Samuel Washington," he said finally, deciding that partial truth would serve his purposes better than continued deception. "And you gentlemen have been chasing the wrong man." "You're a runaway slave," Murphy snarled, his voice thick with the hatred of a man whose worldview was being challenged. "Don't matter what name you give yourself or how fancy you talk." Samuel's laugh was cold and sharp, cutting through the forest air like a blade. "I was born free in Philadelphia, educated at Oberlin College, and commissioned as an intelligence officer in the Union Army. The only thing I'm running from is the tedium of listening to you stumble through these woods like a herd of cattle." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Dawson's continued groans from the pit and the distant sound of wind in the trees. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath as the implications of Samuel's words sank in. Colt was the first to recover, his military training helping him process the new information and adapt to the changed situation. "You're lying," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, doubt creeping in around the edges of his confidence. "Am I?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher instructing slow students. "Tell me, Mr. Colton, and yes, I know who you are. How many runaway slaves do you know who can dig a 6-foot pit, line it with sharpened stakes, and camouflage it well enough to fool an experienced tracker? How many can lead 6 armed men in circles for 3 days, while staying ahead of them the entire time?" Pike's face had gone pale as the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. "Jesus," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We've been hunting a Union spy." "Not hunting," Samuel corrected with the precision of a man who understood the importance of accurate terminology. "Being hunted. The question now is what we do about it." 3 hours later, the hunters had managed to extract Dawson from the pit and fashion a crude stretcher from branches and their coats. The young man's leg was badly punctured, but not broken, and Pike had used his field experience to bind the wounds with strips torn from his shirt. They had retreated to a defensive position near a rocky outcropping that provided cover and multiple escape routes, but the psychological damage was already done. The confident hunters who had entered the forest that morning were gone, replaced by nervous men who jumped at every sound and constantly scanned the tree line for threats they couldn't see. The tables had been turned so completely that they were no longer sure who was hunting whom, but they all knew they weren't really safe. Samuel Washington was out there somewhere, watching, waiting, controlling the situation, with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. Every shadow could conceal an enemy, every rustling leaf could signal an attack, every moment of silence could be the calm before the storm. "This is insane," Murphy muttered, constantly scanning the tree line with the nervous energy of a man who had finally encountered something he couldn't bully or intimidate. "We should just get out of here, take Dawson back to town and forget this whole thing." "And then what?" Colt asked harshly, his military mind already working through the tactical implications of their situation. "You think he's just going to let us walk away? He knows our names, our families, probably our addresses. We're loose ends now, and loose ends get tied up." Pike nodded grimly, his tracker's instincts telling him that they were in more danger now than they had ever been. "He's right. We know too much about him, and he knows too much about us. This doesn't end until one side or the other is dead." Briggs spat into the leaves, his face twisted with frustration and growing fear. "So what are you saying? We should help a Union spy? Commit treason against the Confederacy?" "I'm saying we should think about our options," Colt replied, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. "And right now we don't have many good ones." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and all 5 men tensed, rifles ready. But it was only Thomas returning from a scouting mission, his face grim with the news he carried. "Found tracks leading away from the clearing," he reported. "But they're wrong somehow. Too obvious, like he wants us to follow them. And there's something else. I found 3 different sets of prints, all heading in different directions." Colt cursed under his breath. "He's playing games with us, laying false trails to keep us confused and off balance." From his new position in a cluster of boulders 50 yards away, Samuel listened to their conversation through a small brass listening device, a piece of Union intelligence equipment that amplified distant sounds and allowed operatives to eavesdrop on enemy conversations. The device was one of many technological advantages that gave Union spies an edge over their Confederate counterparts. The hunters were exactly where he wanted them, confused, frightened, and beginning to turn on each other. But Samuel was also reassessing his own situation with the cold calculation of a professional intelligence operative. His original plan had been to neutralize the hunters quickly and continue toward Fredericksburg. But instead he found himself engaged in a complex psychological operation that was consuming valuable time. Every hour he spent in these woods was an hour that Confederate forces could be moving troops or supplies without Union knowledge. His mission was time-sensitive, and he needed to accelerate the timeline while still achieving his objectives. Samuel carefully made his way around the hunter's position, using the rocky terrain and his knowledge of Cherokee movement techniques to mask his approach. His destination was a small stream that ran behind their defensive position, the same stream they would need to use for fresh water and to clean Dawson's wounds. Control the water source, and you control the enemy's options. When he reached the stream, Samuel began to implement the next phase of his plan. From his pack, he withdrew a small vial of clear liquid, a mild sedative that Union intelligence operatives used to incapacitate targets without killing them. A few drops in the stream would be enough to make the hunters drowsy and less alert, giving him the advantage he needed for the final confrontation. But as he knelt beside the water, Samuel heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Someone was coming to the stream, and they were trying to move quietly. Samuel melted into the shadows beside a large boulder, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. Through the undergrowth, he could see Pike Henderson approaching the stream with a water bottle and some bloody bandages. The tracker was moving carefully, his rifle ready, eyes constantly scanning for threats. This was an opportunity Samuel couldn't pass up. Pike was clearly the most skilled of the hunters, and his tracking abilities made him the most dangerous to Samuel's mission. If Samuel could neutralize Pike, the others would be significantly less effective. But as Pike knelt beside the stream to fill his water bottle, something unexpected happened. The tracker suddenly froze, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. His weathered hand moved slowly to his rifle, and his eyes began scanning the area around the stream with the intensity of a man who sensed danger. "I know you're there," Pike said quietly, not looking up from the water. "I can feel you watching me." Samuel remained perfectly still, impressed despite himself by Pike's instincts. The man's survival skills were remarkable, honed by years of dangerous work in hostile territory. "You want to talk?" Pike continued, his voice steady despite the tension in his body. "Then let's talk. But no more games, no more tricks. Just 2 professionals having a conversation." After a moment's consideration, Samuel stepped out from behind the boulder, his hands visible but ready to move to his weapons if necessary. You have good instincts, Mr. Henderson. Pike looked up, and for the first time the two men saw each other clearly. Pike saw a lean, athletic man in his late 20s, dressed in the rough clothes of a field hand, but carrying himself with the confidence of a soldier and the bearing of an educated gentleman. Samuel saw a weathered tracker in his 30s, with intelligent eyes and the steady hands of someone who had spent years surviving in dangerous situations. "You're not what I expected," Pike said, his voice carrying a note of grudging respect. "Neither are you," Samuel replied honestly. "Most slave hunters are thugs and bullies who rely on intimidation and superior numbers. You're something different." Pike nodded slowly, setting down his water bottle but keeping his rifle within easy reach. "I wasn't always in this business. Used to scout for the Army of Northern Virginia before I got wounded at Antietam. Took up tracking runaways because it was the only work I could find that used my skills and paid enough to support my family. And now you're having second thoughts. Now I'm wondering if I've been on the wrong side of this war," Pike admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of growing doubt. "You could have killed me just now. Hell, you could have killed all of us back in that clearing. But you didn't. Why?" Samuel considered his answer carefully, recognizing that this conversation could be the key to resolving the situation without further bloodshed. Pike was clearly the most reasonable of the hunters, and if Samuel could turn him, the others might follow. "Because I'm not a killer, Mr. Henderson. I'm a soldier. There's a difference." "Is there?" Pike asked, his voice challenging but not hostile. "You're behind enemy lines gathering intelligence that will get Confederate soldiers killed. How is that different from putting a bullet in them yourself?" "Because those soldiers chose to take up arms against the United States," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had thought deeply about the moral implications of his work. "They're combatants in a war they helped start. You and your friends are civilians who got caught up in something bigger than yourselves." Pike was quiet for a long moment, processing Samuel's words and weighing them against his own experiences and beliefs. Finally he asked, "What happens now?" "That depends on you," Samuel said, his voice taking on the tone of a negotiator presenting terms. "I need to reach Fredericksburg, and I need information about Confederate positions between here and there. You can help me, or you can continue to oppose me, but understand that I will complete my mission either way." "And if we help you, what happens to us then?" Samuel had been thinking about this question since the confrontation began, weighing the tactical advantages against the moral implications. "You disappear," he said finally. "All of you. Take new names, move to different states, start over. The war won't last forever, and when it's over, there will be opportunities for men with your skills." "You're talking about desertion," Pike said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm talking about survival," Samuel corrected. "How long do you think this war is going to last? How long before the Confederacy runs out of men, money, and supplies? You're smart enough to see which way the wind is blowing." Pike stood up slowly, his water bottle forgotten as he processed the implications of Samuel's offer. "I need to talk to the others." "Of course," Samuel agreed, "but don't take too long. I have a schedule to keep, and every hour of delay puts my mission at risk." As Pike started to walk back toward his companions, Samuel called out softly, "Mr. Henderson?" The tracker turned back, his face questioning. "Your sister's boarding house in Fredericksburg," Samuel said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "The one that caters to Confederate officers. I'm going to need detailed information about her guests, their routines, their conversations. That's not negotiable." Pike's face went pale as the full implications of Samuel's knowledge became clear. "You're asking me to spy on my own sister." "I'm asking you to help end this war," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "The information I gather could save thousands of lives on both sides. Your sister will never know, and when the war is over, she'll be able to rebuild her life, just like everyone else." Pike stared at him for a long moment, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Finally, he nodded slowly and disappeared into the forest, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts and his plans. Samuel waited by the stream, listening to the distant murmur of voices as Pike rejoined his companions. He could imagine the heated discussion taking place, the arguments, the fears, the desperate search for alternatives that didn't exist. These men were trapped between their loyalty to the Confederacy and their desire to survive. And Samuel was offering them a way out that came with a terrible price. 20 minutes later, Pike returned alone, his face grim but determined. "We'll do it," he said simply, "but we want guarantees. Safe passage out of Virginia, new identities, enough money to start over somewhere the war can't reach us." "Done," Samuel agreed without hesitation. "What can you tell me about the road to Fredericksburg?" Pike pulled out a piece of paper and began to sketch a rough map, his tracker's knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable. "There's a Confederate patrol that comes through every other day, usually around noon. 20 men, well armed, led by a sergeant named Collins who knows these woods almost as well as I do. Supply wagons use the main road, but there's a back trail that follows the river. Your biggest problem is going to be the checkpoint at Chancellorsville. They're checking papers on everyone who passes through." Samuel studied the map, memorizing every detail with the trained precision of an intelligence operative. "What about your sister's boarding house?" "The Magnolia Inn," Pike said reluctantly, his voice heavy with the weight of betrayal. "She gets a lot of officers passing through, mostly couriers and staff officers carrying dispatches between Richmond and the front lines. They tend to drink too much and talk too freely, especially around a pretty woman who acts impressed by their war stories." "Perfect," Samuel said, recognizing the intelligence opportunity that Pike's sister represented. "I'll need you to send word ahead that you're bringing a friend to stay for a few days. Someone who's been helping you track runaways and needs a place to lay low." Pike nodded, though his expression was pained. "What about the others? Colt's not going to just walk away from this. He's got too much pride and too much invested in his reputation." "Mr. Colt is a practical man," Samuel replied, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "He'll do what's necessary to protect his interests. But if he becomes a problem, I'll deal with him." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Pike understood that Samuel was offering them a choice, but it wasn't really a choice at all. Cooperation meant survival. Opposition meant death. "There's one more thing," Pike said. "Dawson's hurt bad. He needs a doctor, and we can't take him to any Confederate medical facility without raising questions about how he got injured." "There's a Union field hospital about 10 miles north of here," Samuel said, demonstrating once again the depth of his knowledge about the area. "Doctor, Marcus Webb runs it. Tell him Samuel sent you and he'll take care of your friend without asking questions." Pike's eyes widened as the implications sank in. "You have people everywhere, don't you?" Samuel smiled grimly, allowing Pike to see just a glimpse of the vast intelligence network that supported his operations. "Mr. Henderson, you have no idea how deep this war really goes. The battles you read about in the newspapers are just the surface. Underneath, there's another war being fought, a war of information, infiltration, and deception. And in that war, I'm very good at what I do." As Pike walked back to rejoin his companions for the final time, Samuel began to plan his next moves. He had turned a dangerous obstacle into a valuable asset, but the real work was just beginning. Fredericksburg was still 2 days away, and every mile would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But for the first time since the hunt began, Samuel felt confident about his chances. He had proven something important to himself and to his enemies. In this deadly game of cat and mouse, he was definitely the cat. The question now was whether his prey would stay caught, or try to escape one final time. 2 days later, Samuel Washington sat in the parlor of the Magnolia Inn, sipping coffee and listening to Confederate Captain James Morrison boast about the impregnable defenses of Fredericksburg. The young officer had been drinking since noon, and his tongue had grown increasingly loose as the afternoon wore on. The whiskey had done its work, transforming a cautious staff officer into a fountain of military intelligence. "General Lee himself designed the fortifications," Morrison slurred, leaning closer to Samuel with the conspiratorial air of a man trying to impress a new acquaintance. "Mary's Heights is like a fortress. Stone walls, artillery positions, interlocking fields of fire. Any Union force foolish enough to attack would be slaughtered before they got within 100 yards of our lines." Samuel nodded appreciatively, playing his role as a Confederate sympathizer who had been helping track runaway slaves. Pike's sister, Margaret Henderson, had introduced him as Mr. Johnson, a friend of her brother's who needed a place to stay while recovering from an injury sustained in the line of duty. The cover story was simple and believable, and Margaret had played her part perfectly. The Magnolia Inn was exactly what Samuel had hoped for, a gathering place for Confederate officers traveling between Richmond and the front lines. The parlor was filled with the low murmur of military conversations, the clink of glasses, and the rustle of newspapers carrying news from the various theaters of war. It was an intelligence operative's dream, a place where secrets were traded like currency and loose lips could sink ships. "Sounds like the Yankees would be crazy to try anything," Samuel said, refilling Morrison's glass from the bottle of whiskey on the table between them. The alcohol was doing its work, loosening the young captain's tongue and making him eager to share his knowledge with someone who seemed appropriately impressed. "Crazy or desperate," Morrison agreed, his voice taking on the tone of a man who considered himself an expert on military strategy. "But that's what makes them dangerous. Burnside's taken over from McClellan, and word is he's planning something big, something to prove himself to Lincoln and the politicians in Washington." Samuel's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral and interested rather than eager. This was exactly the kind of intelligence he had been sent to gather, the strategic information that could save thousands of lives if properly used. "Any idea what he's planning?" Morrison glanced around the parlor, then leaned even closer, his breath heavy with whiskey and his voice dropping to what he imagined was a conspiratorial whisper. "Between you and me, our scouts have been reporting massive troop movements north of the Rappahannock. Pontoon bridges, artillery, supply trains, the works. Burnside's going to try to cross the river and take Fredericksburg by force." "When?" Samuel asked, his voice carefully casual despite the importance of the information. "Soon," Morrison said, his eyes bright with the excitement of sharing secret knowledge. "Maybe within the week, but it doesn't matter when he comes. Lee's got over 70. Cice's 00 men dug in on those heights, with artillery positioned to cover every approach. It'll be a massacre." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as the implications of Morrison's words sank in. If the captain was right, the Union Army was about to walk into a trap that would make Antietam look like a skirmish. Thousands of Federal soldiers would die in a futile assault against prepared positions, and the war would drag on for months or years longer than necessary, unless someone warned them. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another Confederate officer, a colonel named Whitman, who commanded a regiment stationed on Mary's Heights. Morrison immediately straightened up, his drunken demeanor replaced by military courtesy as he introduced Samuel to the newcomer. "Colonel Whitman, this is Mr. Johnson. He's been helping Pike Henderson track runaways in the countryside." Whitman shook Samuel's hand with the firm grip of a professional soldier, his eyes sharp and assessing despite his polite smile. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Johnson. Henderson's got quite a reputation as a tracker. Heard he brought in 3 runaways just last month." "Pike's the best there is," Samuel agreed, playing his role while studying the colonel for any signs of suspicion. "I just help where I can." "Well, we appreciate men like you," Whitman said, settling into a chair and accepting a glass of whiskey from Morrison. "Keeping order on the home front is just as important as fighting Yankees on the battlefield." The conversation continued for another hour, with Samuel carefully extracting information about troop dispositions, supply lines, and defensive preparations. By the time the 2 officers left for dinner, he had gathered enough intelligence to fill a detailed report that would be invaluable to Union commanders planning their assault. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Margaret Henderson said, appearing at Samuel's elbow with practiced grace. "Captain Morrison, your dinner is ready in the dining room." Morrison struggled to his feet, swaying slightly as the full effects of the afternoon's drinking made themselves known. "Thank you, Miss Margaret. You're an angel." He turned to Samuel and extended his hand with the exaggerated courtesy of a drunk trying to appear sober. "Good talking with you, Johnson. Maybe we can continue this conversation tomorrow." "I'd like that," Samuel replied, shaking the captain's hand while mentally cataloguing everything he had learned. "Travel safe." As Morrison stumbled toward the dining room, Margaret sat down across from Samuel. She was an attractive woman in her 30s, with the kind of refined southern beauty that made men want to confide their secrets to her. But Samuel could see the intelligence in her eyes and the worry that she was trying to hide behind her gracious hostess facade. He talks too much when he drinks, she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the general conversation in the parlor. Most men do, Samuel replied, recognizing the opening she was giving him. It's a useful trait in your line of work. Margaret's smile was strained, and Samuel could see the conflict playing out behind her eyes. My brother told me what you really are, what you're really doing here. Samuel studied her face, looking for signs of hostility or fear. Instead, he saw resignation and something that might have been relief. And how do you feel about that? Tired, she said simply, her voice heavy with the weight of months of pretending and performing. I'm tired of this war, tired of watching boys march off to die, tired of pretending to care about Confederate victories while I count the cost in broken families and empty chairs at dinner tables. Your brother said you might be willing to help. My brother said you offered him a way out of this madness, Margaret replied, her voice taking on a note of desperate hope. Is that true? Samuel nodded, recognizing the opportunity that Margaret represented. For all of you. New identities, safe passage north, enough money to start over somewhere the war can't reach you. But I need something in return. Information, Margaret said, demonstrating that Pike had explained everything to her. I know Pike told me what you need. Not just information, Samuel corrected, his voice taking on a note of urgency. I need you to get a message to the Union lines, tonight. Margaret's eyes widened with fear and surprise. That's impossible. The roads are crawling with Confederate patrols and... There's a way, Samuel interrupted, his mind already working through the logistics of the operation. Your brother mentioned that you sometimes send supplies to the Union Field Hospital north of here. Dr. Webb has been treating wounded from both sides, and the Confederates have been allowing medical supplies to pass through their lines under a flag of truce. You want me to carry a message to Dr. Webb? I want you to carry a message that could save thousands of lives, Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Captain Morrison was right about one thing. Burnside is planning to attack Fredericksburg, but he doesn't know about the full extent of Lee's preparations. If the Union Army attacks those heights without proper intelligence, it will be a slaughter. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup as she wrestled with the implications of what Samuel was asking. Finally, she looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of fear and determination. What do you need me to do? Samuel reached into his jacket and withdrew a small, sealed envelope that contained the most important intelligence he had gathered in 2 years of operations behind enemy lines. This contains detailed information about Confederate positions, troop strengths, and defensive preparations. Dr. Webb will know how to get it to the right people. Margaret took the envelope with trembling hands, understanding that she was holding information that could change the course of the war. And if I'm caught? You won't be, Samuel said with more confidence than he felt. You've been making these supply runs for months. The Confederate guards know you, trust you. Just act natural and stick to your usual routine. What about you? What happens after I deliver this message? Samuel stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening streets of Fredericksburg. Confederate soldiers were everywhere, preparing for the battle they were certain they would win. They had no idea that their plans were about to be exposed to their enemies, or that the intelligence advantage they thought they possessed was about to be neutralized. I disappear, he said finally, his voice carrying the finality of a man who had made his decision. My mission here is complete. Pike and the others are already on their way north with their new identities. By tomorrow night, I'll be across Union lines with intelligence that could change the course of this war. And me, Samuel turned back to face her, seeing the uncertainty and fear in her eyes. You have a choice. You can stay here and continue running your boarding house, pretending to support a cause you don't believe in. Or you can come with me and start a new life where you don't have to pretend anymore. Margaret's hand went to her throat, where a small locket hung on a gold chain, probably a memento of her dead husband. This house has been in my family for 3 generations. My husband built the addition before he died at Bull Run. Everything I am is tied to this place. Everything you were, Samuel corrected gently, understanding the weight of the decision she faced. The question is, what do you want to become? Before Margaret could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch interrupted their conversation. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his concealed pistol as the front door burst open with a crash that silenced the entire parlor. Jeremiah Colt stood in the doorway, his rifle leveled at Samuel's chest. Behind him were Murphy and Briggs, both armed and looking grim. The other guests in the parlor scrambled for cover as the three men entered with the purposeful stride of hunters who had finally cornered their prey. "Well, well," Colt said, his voice cold with fury and satisfaction. "Look what we have here." The famous Union spy sitting pretty in a Confederate boarding house, Samuel remained perfectly still, calculating distances and angles, while keeping his expression calm and controlled. The parlor offered limited cover, and Colt was too far away to reach before he could pull the trigger. But Samuel had faced worse odds before, and he had learned that the key to survival was staying calm and looking for opportunities. "Mr. Colt," he said calmly, his voice betraying none of the tension he felt, "I thought you and your friends were heading north." "Change of plans?" Colt replied, his smile cold and predatory. "See, I got to thinking about our little arrangement, about how you knew so much about our families, our personal lives, and I realized something important." "What's that?" Colt's smile widened, revealing teeth stained by years of tobacco use. "Dead men don't collect bounties, but live Union spies? Well, that's a different story. The Confederate government pays very well for captured enemy agents." Samuel felt a surge of admiration for Colt's cunning, even as he prepared to fight for his life. The man had recognized an opportunity and taken it, despite the risks. It was exactly what Samuel would have done in his position: turn a dangerous situation into a profitable one. "You're making a mistake," Samuel said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Am I?" Colt asked, his rifle never wavering from Samuel's chest. "Murphy, check him for weapons." As Murphy stepped forward with the eager anticipation of a man about to collect a substantial bounty, Samuel made his move. He dove to his left, rolling behind a heavy wooden table as Colt's rifle boomed in the confined space. The bullet splintered the wall where Samuel's head had been a moment before, and the sound of the gunshot sent the remaining guests screaming for the exits. Margaret dropped to the floor as Samuel came up with his pistol in his hand. He fired twice in rapid succession, and Murphy spun around with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped through his fingers. "Kill him!" Colt shouted, working the lever of his rifle to chamber another round. But Samuel was already moving, using the furniture as cover as he made his way toward the back of the house. Briggs fired and missed, the bullet shattering a china cabinet and filling the air with flying porcelain. Samuel returned fire, and Briggs dove for cover behind the sofa. "Margaret!" Samuel called out over the sound of gunfire. "The message! Get it to Dr. Webb!" He saw her nod and crawl toward the kitchen, the envelope clutched in her hand. Whatever happened to him, the intelligence would reach Union lines, and thousands of lives would be saved. Colt appeared in the doorway to the hall, his rifle ready and his face twisted with determination. "End of the line, spy." Samuel smiled grimly, reaching into his pocket for one final surprise. Not quite. He pulled a small metal cylinder from his pocket and yanked out the pin. The smoke grenade, another piece of Union intelligence equipment, began hissing immediately, filling the parlor with thick white smoke that obscured vision and created chaos. In the confusion that followed, Samuel made his escape through the back door, disappearing into the maze of alleys and side streets that he had spent 2 days memorizing. Behind him, he could hear Colt cursing and shouting orders to his men, but Samuel was already gone, melting into the shadows like the ghost his enemies had never quite managed to catch. 3 hours later, Margaret Henderson arrived at Dr. Webb's field hospital with a wagon full of medical supplies and a message that would save thousands of Union lives. The intelligence Samuel had gathered would reach General Burnside within hours, giving him crucial information about Confederate defensive positions and allowing him to modify his attack plans accordingly. The Battle of Fredericksburg would still be fought, but it would be fought on more equal terms, with Union forces prepared for the challenges they would face. The massive casualties that Lee had planned for would be reduced, and the war would be shortened by months. And somewhere in the Virginia wilderness, a master spy named Samuel Washington continued his journey north, carrying with him the satisfaction of a mission accomplished and the knowledge that sometimes the hunted could become the hunter. The 6 slave hunters who had thought they were chasing a helpless runaway had learned a hard lesson about the price of underestimation. In a war where information was power, they had encountered a man who wielded that power like a weapon, turning their own assumptions and prejudices against them with devastating effectiveness. Pike Henderson and his wounded companion Dawson had indeed made it safely to Dr. Webb's field hospital, where they received not only medical treatment, but new identities and safe passage to Union territory. Pike's tracking skills would later prove invaluable to federal forces operating in Virginia, and he would spend the remainder of the war guiding Union cavalry raids against Confederate supply lines. Jeremiah Colt and his remaining men would spend the next 3 days searching the streets of Fredericksburg for a ghost who had already vanished into the night. Their failure to capture the Union spy would damage Colt's reputation irreparably, and within a month, his slave hunting operation would collapse as clients lost confidence in his abilities. He would end the war as a broken man, haunted by the memory of the quarry who had turned the tables on him so completely. Margaret Henderson would indeed choose to abandon her old life, following Samuel's escape route north to begin again in a place where she could live according to her conscience, rather than the expectations of a society built on human bondage. The Magnolia Inn would be sold to pay her debts, and she would disappear into the anonymity of wartime displacement, eventually settling in Ohio, where she would run a small school for freed slaves. But perhaps the most important consequence of Samuel's mission was the intelligence that reached Union headquarters just hours before Burnside's planned assault. The detailed information about Confederate defensive positions allowed Federal commanders to modify their attack, concentrating their forces on the weakest points in Lee's line, rather than launching the frontal assault that would have resulted in catastrophic casualties. When the Battle of Fredericksburg was finally fought on December 13, 1862, it was still a Union defeat, but not the massacre that Lee had planned. Federal casualties were heavy but manageable, and Burnside was able to withdraw his forces in good order, rather than suffering the complete destruction that Confederate commanders had anticipated. The war would continue for 2 more years, but Samuel Washington's intelligence had shortened it by months and saved thousands of lives on both sides. In the shadow war of espionage and deception that ran parallel to the more famous battles, one man's courage and intelligence had struck a blow for freedom that would echo through history. As Samuel crossed into Union territory 3 days later, he carried with him not only the satisfaction of a mission accomplished, but also the knowledge that he had proven something important about the nature of warfare itself. In a conflict where both sides believed that victory belonged to the strongest and most ruthless, he had demonstrated that sometimes the greatest weapon was the ability to think, to plan, and to turn an enemy's assumptions against them. The slave hunters had learned too late that their quarry was not the helpless victim they had expected, but a master of the deadly game they thought they understood. In underestimating Samuel Washington, they had made the same mistake that the Confederacy itself would eventually make, assuming that intelligence, education, and strategic thinking were the exclusive province of white men. That assumption would prove to be one of the many fatal errors that would ultimately cost the South the war. And Samuel Washington's mission was just one small part of the larger intelligence network that would help bring about the Union's ultimate victory. The hunt was over, but the war continued. And in that war, men like Samuel Washington would prove that the pen, properly wielded, could indeed be mightier than the sword. The story of Samuel Ghost Washington reminds us that history's greatest heroes often operated in the shadows, using intelligence and courage to change the course of events. Their sacrifices helped preserve the Union and end the institution of slavery, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a rifle or cannon, but the human mind applied with precision and purpose. If this incredible story of espionage and survival moved you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you the most amazing untold stories from history every week. Tales of courage, intelligence, and determination that shape the world we live in today. Like this video if you enjoyed learning about this remarkable spy, and let us know in the comments. What other Civil War stories would you like to hear? Your suggestions help us choose our next incredible tale. Were you surprised by the intelligence networks that operated during the Civil War? Do you think Samuel's methods were justified by the circumstances? And remember, history is full of heroes whose stories deserve to be told. From the battlefields of Gettysburg to the secret missions behind enemy lines, every week we uncover another amazing adventure from the past. Stay tuned for more incredible stories that will leave you amazed by the courage and ingenuity of those who came before us. Next week, we'll be exploring another untold story from the Civil War, the tale of a Confederate nurse